Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Social Suite's latest webinar around double materiality. Just before we do kick off, just a couple of housekeeping rules. You notice there's a chat box on the right-hand side. So as we're going through the webinar, if you do have any questions, feel free to pop them in that chat box. We do have a section at the end for the Q&A to go through those as well. And there'll also be a couple of polls on the right-hand side as well, coming throughout the webinar. So for those of you not aware who we are, Social Suite, we are a software, sustainability and ESG company based here in Melbourne. Been around since 2013. We've got over 150 organisations on the platform, primarily across Australia, both private and listed. And we're working obviously with those organisations through materiality and double materiality. So it can be quite a confusing space for a lot of organisations. So to help us simplify what it means, what is the process, we're joined by our Chief Impact Officer, Dr. Siegenbeek van Heukelom. Just before I do hand across to Tim, I'm just going to pop one of those polls up on the right-hand side just to help us, steer the conversation, just understanding where are organisations at in regards to materiality. Are you simply just in the education phase? What does this possibly mean? Are you looking to start the process, understand, what is material to our business, or is it something you're already currently running and you're looking at maybe ways of streamlining and ensuring that you're on the right track as well? So you can see the responses coming in, Tim. So I think it's a pretty mixed bag. So I'm not too sure if that helps guide the conversation, but I'd like to hand over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tom, and welcome everyone. I see that we're kind of in the poll moving towards the majority in education phase. So regardless of where you are, welcome. And what we want to do today in our webinar about double materiality in practice, we want to touch upon three areas with you. We want to talk about the why, the what, and the how of double materiality. Now, we realize that there's already quite a lot of information out there, in particular about the why and the what. So we'll spend the majority of the time on the how, and that is really an underserved area we find where there's not a lot of information. How do you actually, the nitty gritty of running a double materiality assessment? What are the steps? What are the components, the considerations? But again, looking at that education, we'll also provide a quick intro running through the why. Why is materiality important in corporate sustainability? What is materiality and double materiality? And then we'll really dig into the how. At the end, we'll have a few frequently asked questions, and as Tom flagged, we'll have a questions and answer section. So if you have questions throughout the webinar, post them immediately. If it's at the right time, I might just use them straight away, or we'll leave until the end. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can. So first off, let's start with what is materiality. Materiality is really the importance of a particular item of information to a decision maker. Now, that's not really, it's very generic, not very specific. So when we take that into the context of sustainability reporting, materiality really is about the importance of particular sustainability issues to a company's financial performance. So think about the enterprise value at large, but also to the company's impact it has on the world at large. Think about the environment and society. So already here, the two perspectives around materiality. And that will be really important because we're looking at double materiality today. So those two perspectives there, you already feel where we're going. They're creating that double materiality. But we'll look at that in a little bit more detail in a moment. Now, why is materiality important in corporate sustainability? I think there are at large three reasons or three components we need to look at. First off, for the business itself. Determining what is material is really important to decide what information you're disclosing. So if something is material, that means you need to provide information on that particular sustainability matter to your external stakeholders. So by determining which issues, fall within the threshold of material, you know what information you should start disclosing. So it really helps you in that sustainability and ESG reporting space. Out of all those possible E, S, and G topics that are there, you really get a focus on what is important. In doing that, you also really have a focus on helping to guide and even influence your corporate strategy. So sustainability should not be a bolted on component that you do because, it's a do-good initiative. It really should be part and parcel of how you run your business and how you set your strategy. And by defining what is material, that really should feed into that strategy setting process. With that, we can also have a really clear focus then on driving your resourcing, your hiring. Where are the gaps in terms of those material areas in the sustainability space? Where do you need additional systems, additional expertise within your team to report or to enhance the performance on those sustainability issues? And it also informs your risk management. You might already have your traditional ERM or risk management processes in place, but are you already kind of set up in a way that you really feed into sustainability related risks and climate risks into those more traditional processes? So those four things, there's a number more, but these are really the four key ones that are relevant directly to your business. If you look at the larger ecosystem in which you operate, by defining and determining what is material, you get some competitive insights, because you're not just looking at your own business, you're looking across your value chain. You're looking at what is your industry doing, your peers and your competitors. And that might give you strategic advantages by really knowing where you should focus your attention. It can enhance decision making because you know where those particular environmental or social risks are sitting. And equally, there's on the one side the risk, there's also opportunity, and it can really help you access market opportunities. And we've seen that with a number of customers that really went into the carbon space and found that there were some really interesting opportunities around carbon credits. And finally, there are your stakeholders. And stakeholders can be a whole wide group of people interested in your sustainability performance. The investors are often really interested in comparable decision useful data. And you've got your regulators that require you to align with any regulatory requirements. It also really helps to have meaningful engagement with stakeholders, to really demonstrate to them that you're listening and taking their views into account by conducting a double materiality assessment. And across that value chain, you also find that you're not the only one doing this. So there will be that level of that increasing reciprocal accountability, where you're asking, in your supply chain for maybe scope 3 emissions data, that you get requests back with similar information, or about human rights or modern slavery. So more and more data exchanges will take place with your stakeholders. So these are some high-level reasons why materiality is so important in corporate sustainability. But materiality is only one component. And I'll ask Tom to just put in a quick other poll there. There's a lot of other things that might be on your mind there. So maybe while we continue, just have a look at the poll there and think about what else is really on your mind. Yes, materiality, but maybe also the incoming Australian climate regulations, or how to actually build your first GHG emissions inventory. Maybe you are affected by the European CSRD regulations, or there might be something else that's on your mind that you're trying to figure out. And maybe type that in the chat so that we have some idea of where you're coming from and what education and support you need. Now let's jump back then to the core topic. Already flagged that double materiality is made up of two components. It's the company's impact on the environment and society, on people, but it's also the financial effects of sustainability risks and opportunities on the company. Now these two concepts we call respectively impact materiality, so that's those impacts on people and the environment, and we'll have to really look at the business plus your entire value chain. So really make sure that you don't just assess the core activities and not look up and downstream. That all should be included in that materiality assessment that focuses on impact. On the other side, there's that financial materiality. So that's the financial effects on the company. And then we're mostly looking at risks and opportunities. So you see there's that interaction between what's happening at large in the world around sustainability and what's happening within your business, and how are those two influencing each other? What are the impacts they're having on each other? A little bit more detail then on each one of them. What should you be looking at from an impact perspective? It's really that inside out perspective. Looking at how is your company directly or indirectly having actual or potential positive or negative impacts on the world at large. And actual and negative impacts are mostly front of mind, but make sure not to forget potential impacts or positive impacts. And of course, there are on people, on the environment at large. So think about the E and the S there, but also keep in mind that we're not looking at a very short time frame. Yes, that is important, but also consider the medium and long-term time frames. It's really important to really take a much longer time frame than you might traditionally do in reporting. If we look at the outside-in perspective, so look at financial materiality, we're really looking for the financial effects on your business, actual or potential again, and we're focusing now on risk and opportunities. So here again, the same goes. Don't forget the potential effects and don't forget the opportunities. And we're looking at how are these risks and opportunities impacting your enterprise value. What does that mean? What effects are they having on your cash flows, on your ability for development, your performance, your market position, cost of capital, access to finance, etc. Any financial effects potentially actually on the business, positive or negative, are what you should be looking at. And again, over that short, medium, and long-term horizon. So maybe that horizon is a bit longer than your more traditional financial accounting systems would take into account. So make sure that you really take that full kind of horizon there. Now, what is that evolution towards double materiality? So how do we get here effectively? Those two approaches, impact materiality and financial materiality, have been around for quite a while now. And if you look at existing ESG reports over the last years, you might find one or the other, let's call them a single materiality approach, either an impact or a financial materiality approach, in all kind of ESG or sustainability or impact reports from companies. If you look on the left-hand side here, you see that they're often, this is a generalized materiality matrix, looks something like that. They'll map the internal stakeholders and the external stakeholders, each on an axis. And then they've asked these stakeholders, how important is this particular topic to you or to our business? And with that, you get some low priority, medium, and high priority topics. And often, not always, but often the high priority topics are then identified as these are material or most material to our business. So that approach then is either mapping impact, and that is what the Global Reporting Initiative or GRI is mostly focused on, or the mapping financial materiality, and that is what traditionally frameworks like SASB, now under the ISSB, is more looking at, really that kind of investor-driven, the financial effects on a company. Double materiality is trying to bring that together. Do both of them, but both are valid views of the world, but we'll learn a lot more if we can combine those two views. So what double materiality is doing then is saying, let's plot financial materiality against impact materiality and work out which topics are material on an impact scale, which topics are financially material, and which topics might be double material. Now, it's really important that under this approach, a sustainability matter is material when it meets the criteria for impact, for financial, or both. So any three of those blue boxes here, whether they're light or dark blue, means that an issue has crossed the materiality threshold, the red line you see there. Once it's crossed that, it is a material sustainability matter for your business. If it doesn't cross that and sits in that bottom left, not material box, it's still important to really monitor that issue. There's a lot of dynamics going on in the world today. A lot of things can change quite quickly. So you want to make sure that an issue, you keep an eye on an issue. It might move quicker than you might expect into either an impact or financial materiality threshold there that it crosses. So that is that evolution towards double materiality. And that is what companies are looking at. Those thresholds here, where you set them, is really up to your own business. You need to work out where is the threshold, when does something for us become material from an impact or financial point of view. Now, your finance and accounting team for your financial reporting are already doing this from a financial point of view, which might not fully and automatically translate to the financial materiality topics here from a sustainability point of view, but they might have a lot of experience already in setting those thresholds. So it's worth talking to them and see what you can learn from that to set your own criteria and thresholds. Now, that was the why and the what. Really briefly, the main thing I think you're here today is learn more about the how. And what we found in the market is that there's a lot of information available on the why and the what, but there's not so much on the more practical side. What are some of the steps, components that you can really take to run a double materiality assessment? So everyone's been talking about double materiality but how is really the challenge. And there are many ways. So that's something I want to really put out there. There's not a right or a wrong approach to double materiality. There's many ways. Many companies do it in a slightly different way. They do it, consultants each have their own methodology and approach and way of scoring and way of mapping and way of presenting that materiality matrix. Now, one thing we do find is that double materiality is regulated in Europe now under the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD, and they require you every year as part of your sustainability reporting to do a double materiality assessment. In the legislation and in the guidance from CSRD, it outlines in quite a lot of detail what you should be doing. So the what's covered quite extensively. But to a degree, CSRD pushes on the how you implement that and how you run that and how you work that out back onto the companies and practitioners. They tell you this is what you need to do, but how you do that in detail, you work that out. So what you'll see over the next year or years is that companies and consultants and practitioners were all trying to interpret that CSRD legislative framework and come up with a way of doing this. So the how to run a double materiality assessment will be based to a degree on CSRD, but it might look slightly different with different steps or different sequences. CSRD has some really clear requirements about certain components. Today is not a CSRD deep dive, so we're not going to go very deep into CSRD, but we'll make sure that a lot of the thinking here that we'll go through in a moment is definitely aligned with where CSRD is coming from. So how do you run it then? We've defined 4 phases here, or 4 steps, if you like. Going from setup to collect, which is really the data collection there, putting things together, to doing the analysis, and then reporting what you've done and how you've done it. So 4 broad steps with each there are subcomponents. We'll go through each one of these 4 in a little bit more detail, and I'll take you through those subcomponents, how some of those subcomponents really apply to your business to make it fit for purpose is really more of a tailored deep dive that you really need to work out. And we'll talk a little bit at the end of the webinar about finding the right solution that's right-sized for your organization. Across these 4 stages, there's 2 things I want you to keep in mind: process and methodology. As you go, record everything you do. And this is really important. So document all the considerations, the stakeholders you've involved, the methodology you've used, the sources you've tapped, anything. The more you can document from, step 1 till step 4, the better. Because in the end, if you look at stage 4 there, you'll see describe the process and report the outcomes. Now, back in the day, maybe report the outcome was, the focus area. That's what we're going for. And describing the process was not that important. But today, it is equally important. And CSRD, as well as GRI, are really putting a very strong emphasis on show me how you got there. So think back when you're in a classroom, you provided the right answer to the teacher, and he said, well, how did you get there? Show me how you got to that answer. Show me how you got to your material topics. Demonstrate how you've engaged your stakeholders, what your considerations were. And that's something I cannot stress enough. Document and describe the process transparently. Now, stakeholder engagement is always a big question around doing a double materiality or materiality assessment. How do you engage stakeholders, but mostly when and where? The key answer is really you'll engage stakeholders across the way, across the whole process. Every step of the way, there's some stakeholder you might be engaging with. So you do see that in step 2, there is stakeholder engagement. And it's really important to put that in there as a component. But that doesn't mean in step 1, 3, and 4, you're not engaging with some internal or maybe external stakeholders. So it's really important to keep that front of mind, document the process and the methodology, and consider every step of the way, which stakeholders should I engage here? So with that, let's jump into that first component, the setup here. Now, this is the most steps in here. So this is the really kind of making sure you start off right. The first one is really important. That is internal alignment. So you're going to run your double materiality assessment, but is that just you? Are you responsible? And are you the person? Are you, a lone ranger running this? Or can you establish a task force or a sustainability committee? And can you get cross-functional engagement? The broader, the better. And it's really important to get that ownership across the business, because that gets you a lot more engagement from your internal stakeholders, a lot more understanding, and much better quality insights. So setting up a committee at the start there that helps you run ESG or sustainability, or just maybe materiality, with people from across the business is really a prerequisite almost to really doing a quality materiality assessment. Now, with them, work out who are all our stakeholders, internal and external. So come up with that stakeholder mapping. To whom is this important? And that will then kind of also really be relevant for the next step, value chain assessment. But also consider, who are your silent stakeholders? And what we often mean with that is the stakeholders that don't have clear representation, like nature or future generations. Now, often you can find the traditional groups of stakeholders quite easily through your communications, your investor relations, procurement, HR. So don't start from scratch. Get the lists and the groups already out there and evolve those functions and departments to really do that mapping. To help with that mapping, do a value chain assessment. So look at upstream, core, and downstream activities and capture all those activities, not just to map your stakeholders, but to really get a sense of what is your entire value chain. Because what we're going to do in phase 2 is really look for each of those activities across the value chain. What are the sustainability topics and the impacts and risks and opportunities? So make sure here that you engage with your functional heads or the key internal stakeholders to work out what are those components and activities that we have across that entire value chain. Think about your materiality thresholds. So define a sound materiality methodology and clearly record that methodology at the start. You don't want to end up with going through this whole exercise and then ending up with a list of 20 topics and you don't know where to cut them. You're just going to say, oh, just pick the top 10 topics. Work out where you set those red lines that we looked at earlier. If you work that out from the start, at the end, you'll see automatically what becomes material or not. And talk to finance and your leadership team, because finance might have some experience in setting, from a finance accounting perspective, thresholds, and leadership might have some views on where they want to set those boundaries. Another really key component at the start of the setup is think about education and change management. Identify relevant education initiatives that might need to take place to make sure there's really a sense of organizational ownership of ESG, understanding of ESG, and why you're doing this exercise. So make sure, like I said at the start, that there is this cross-functional understanding of doing a materiality assessment. This is why we're doing it. It really drives engagement. If you're inviting people to do a survey or an interview or come to a workshop around materiality, if they already know that this process is happening and why it's happening, that helps a lot. And then get your key internal stakeholders there. Get the word out through your comms team and HR. Talk to leadership, how they can push the message down. Talk to your investor relations, how they can talk to your external stakeholders. So there's a lot happening in this setup phase, and there might be even more components, but these are the key things to really think about. The next phase then is data collection, really looking at what are those sustainability topics that are relevant to us. So I'm not going to say material yet. In this phase, we're not going to determine if something is material. That is when you start analyzing in the next phase. Right now, we're really interested in a long list of all relevant sustainability matters and use your value chain mapping for that. So across each of those upstream core business activities and downstream, look at where are potentially sustainability areas and link them to the IROs, the impacts, risks, and opportunities, and just list all of them. It's recommended you start with impacts because impacts often automatically lead to risks and opportunities, but also then once you've gone through all the impacts and the associated risks and opportunities, think, are there any risks and opportunities that might not be related to an impact? And capture everything. Use your leadership, your functional heads, external stakeholders, whoever you need to get that long list of your IROs and your relevant sustainability matters. And check that with your stakeholders. Engage stakeholder groups through this. So use your stakeholder mapping to work out at what stage are you going to get from what group inputs. Collect additional IROs or sustainability matters from your stakeholders. and use third-party data sources and information and expertise to really, shape those lists as well. Now, these things, I've highlighted those 4 actions here in yellow because these 4 actions are not sequential. They're almost like intertwined. They're really happening at the same time and they reinforce each other. So it might be that you start out with your business activities and think about the impacts, and then look at this impact we identify to one of our core production processes. It's an impact on the world, it's a negative impact, and with that there's a risk. We also see an opportunity out of that. And this is in what sustainability area? This is around climate, around carbon emissions. So that's one way of doing it. But you can also start with some of those sustainability matters that you believe are already relevant to your business and think about the impacts, the risks and opportunities you're facing. Maybe you use some third-party data, so you could be using research, scientific research or industry group research, where you see what are your competitors reporting on and start with that. So you really want to, have these 4 actions reinforce each other, that you end up with a long list of topics and IROs that has been checked with stakeholders. What do they believe is most important? What are their views? What have they added to this? Then you do the analysis of that data. So you're going to score those IROs. You're going to look at, what has the highest impact there. So the best thing to do is figure out what is a fit for purpose approach here. So how are you going to use more qualitative insights you've learned maybe from interviews, and maybe you've done surveys and got scores on particular topics, so the quantitative methodology, and describe that. Again, in that process, describe how you're doing that. Once you've done that, applied scores to your data set, look at your criteria that you set and the thresholds that you set at that very first stage there. And that enables you then to quite easily consolidate your material IROs and sustainability topics. So this is where you go from that long list and starting to really apply the threshold and see which topics flow to the top into those areas that are material. And then once you've done that, review that with your team. Look at where do we land with this? Are there any surprises, any insight? Do we need to make any tweaks now or next year? And across this, work with your ESG task force or committee, engage leadership in that review. But the key thing here is to really think about what is your best fit for purpose, repeatable process that mitigates bias as best you can, and that creates comparable outputs. And describe that clearly in your documentation. Now, if you want to learn a little bit more about how you potentially could do the IRO scoring, CSRD has some further details. So you can do a bit more of a deep dive into CSRD and look at some of the criteria they said that you can use. How exactly what scores you apply to them is up to you. So it's always useful to look at that to get an insight or inspiration for creating your own fit for purpose scoring methodology. Now, if you have to do CSRD double materiality, definitely make sure you follow the steps from CSRD, because that is required. There's still some things you have to figure out on your own or with the help of an expert or a consultant. But in any case, you need to come up with a fit for purpose approach, and it might not be perfect, and that is okay. There's definitely a lot of flexibility. The key thing here is, as long as you describe what you've done, that is more important than, as your teacher said, I don't care you got to the wrong answer, at least we understand how you got there. So there's no right and wrong in doing materiality here, but be transparent and open about how you develop this and ask people around you how they're doing it. So that final stage then is you now have your list with your material impacts, risks, and opportunities and their related sustainability topics. So get ready now to report that. And yes, report the outcomes here and make sure that when you do that, also describe where is that leading to? What are you going to do next? When are you going to run a materiality assessment again? How does this feed into your metrics you're disclosing, your strategy, your resourcing, your focus areas around ESG, any risks that you were or were not aware of? So think about those things and describe that. And as I flagged at the start, this is the time now to really share that this description of the process you've gone through. And is that clear? And is it repeatable? And what are your thoughts? And what might you change next year? And finally, then, do you have to do assurance? If that's the case, start that process now. Provide your auditor with all the documentation. But it's really important to have a chat internally, maybe even in step one, to think about, are we required to have a level of assurance around this? CSRD does require you to do that. And if that is a yes, then make sure that you speak early to your auditor to understand their requirements, that you don't have to reverse engineer the process when you get to the end. Make sure that if you're required to do a level of assurance, that you take your auditor at the start and say, this is the process we're planning to go through. Are there any additional components or steps we need to take to make sure that your job is easier or can be done at all at the end? Now, realize these 4 steps, there's still a lot of detail you need to work out there. And that is quite normal. These are some of the steps you might follow. You might follow them in a slightly different order. You might move things around, and that is fine. If you really want to learn a little bit more about some of those scoring components, look at CSRD. Finally, then, what are some of the key questions that we heard about doing this? Now, what is better, single or double materiality? It really depends on your objectives, but we do see in the market that double materiality assessment is really becoming best practice. And maybe at some point that CSRD approach is the gold standard for doing a double materiality assessment. How frequently should we do a materiality assessment? Well, CSRD requires it to do it annually. So best practice is to at least yearly look at it. It is part and parcel of your ongoing yearly sustainability reporting. But consider, do we have to do a deep dive every year? Can we do a light review? And what would that look like? And how do we ensure that we still capture the relevant components? So looking at it annually is really important, but decide what level of effort you put into that. And that is a question that comes up as well. What pre-work is required before we can get started? And what level of effort is required when we go through this? I think the pre-work is really having buy-in from the top, but also having that cross-functional support to make sure that you can do this work. Like I said, if you're the lone ranger to do this, it's going to be very hard. If you get support across the business who understands what you're doing and why you're doing it and are there to support the rollout, it will be a lot easier and your insights will be much better. And then what is the timeline to run a materiality assessment? We see that most assessments can be completed within 3 months. There's always exceptions where it's harder to get engagement or more needs to happen. So it can take a little longer. But we also see parties that are ready to go, that have their committees, that know what to do, and that really quickly run through the whole assessment cycle. The final component then is, where are you? And we saw already that some people are still in education or looking to run their first materiality assessment, already running it and hoping to enhance that. Now, finding the right solution or the right approach in doing this, we just went through the steps of doing it, but now how do you go about it? On the spectrum, this is a pretty generalized spectrum here, but talking to a lot of companies, we see that on the very far left side, if we ask about materiality, we get people say, that was a captain's call. So a discretionary decision by the board or C-suite member that said, these are 5 or 10 topics, they're material. Now that is quick, it's easy and it's cheap, but it doesn't really give you a lot of insights there. It's almost like that you gave the right answer to the teacher, but you can't really explain how you got there. Next best is having an internal ESG person lead that process. And ideally, again, with that buy-in from the top and cross-functional support, they use spreadsheets and survey platforms and other tools. So a whole range of things. If you move a step up, there's all these software solutions. Of course, we're at Social Suite provide a solution as well that are really designed to help you do a materiality assessment. There's a range there of options, and it's worth looking at what's the right fit for you? What are you planning to do? Does it need to be CSRD compliant? Are you doing that review or a deep dive? Are you running a single or double materiality assessment? What's the best fit for you? And then you're moving more into consultancy, really, looking at either from a boutique or medium or top tier consultant. Really at that far end of the spectrum here, you get deep dives using proprietary methodologies and surveys, interviews, third-party data, custom analysis, everything and anything under the sun. But there is definitely a price tag there. Often you get quality data, but is that what you need? It really depends. So there's a lot of options here to look at how you can best support your team to run through those steps. A lot of people ask us then the question, I don't really know. And that's when you really want to have a chat and talk about how can you best run your first materiality assessment, or what can you do to streamline that process? What are your main pain points in doing that now? So our team can really help you talk about this, find the right solution. You can look at, if you want to look at our platform, you can book an appointment. And Tom will put a link in the chat now, so you can book an appointment with our team, so you can have a discussion around where you are, what your aims are, and maybe at large even where does Materiality fit into the overall ESG or sustainability journey you're on. So think about those things while you're booking potentially an appointment with Tom there. I want to hand it back to Tom as well to say to see if there's any questions that came up in today's webinar and see if what we can answer.
Thanks, Tim. Here's some really practical steps, and I think hopefully it simplifies the process for a lot of organizations as well. But as you mentioned, happy to have a further conversation. What we like to do with organizations is show what other similar companies are reporting against the metrics and provide a good baseline. So if anyone's interested in that, then feel free to book a time. But I know Anthony has popped a question in, so we'll address that shortly. But as we're going through the first question, if anyone else has got any other questions, then feel free to pop that into the chat as well. So Tim, Anthony's asked, can you discuss the relative merits of weighting on internal versus external insights in an IRO scoring process?
Great question. I think across all your stakeholders and stakeholder groups, you might have internal groups like board and management, employees, you have your external groups. There's really thinking, what are the most important areas where they can really provide us information? So sometimes you see people just have a blanket approach. Every stakeholder gets the same survey. But at other times, and I think that is a bit more, I think, on your question there, is really thinking about what group can provide me with what type of information. The board might be really across with their oversight function, both the impacts, the risk, and the opportunities. Your investors might be more focused on risk and opportunities. There might be other stakeholders that are really kind of monitoring your business for the impacts you're having on the world. So think about what are you asking each stakeholder at what stage in the process. And if you're asking them to score a particular matter, how important is that particular score to you? So it might be that you're way down a particular group. We've seen a lot of like resource operations that have hundreds of landowners, for instance, and they all have a particular focus there. So you get a lot of them come back. You might weigh that down a little bit versus a much smaller group that has some really interesting insights. So I think it's two things. It is looking at, what information can I really learn from this particular stakeholder group and asking them the right questions. And then also thinking, do I apply a particular weighing to groups? So, weigh a group more than another group to balance it out.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. And I think, Anthony, we've seen a lot of companies struggle using disparate tools and systems, in order to be able to separate internal versus external and different weightings. It's something the platform can, with Social Suite, can assist with as well. Another question from Shan: how deep do value chains need to go?
Well, if you ask CSRD, as deep as you can go, and I know that is the most challenging thing. I mean, this whole sustainability space, value chains are extremely challenging because it's largely outside of your control. You have to go to other people that are outside of your business to get information. I think the main thing is, and that is, so there's 2 points that CSRD often looks at. It says on the one hand, goes as far and deep as you can, but without undue cost and effort. So what that means is what is reasonably possible for you to achieve. And keep that in mind with all this materiality, sustainability, ESG work without undue cost and effort. So what is reasonably possible in this reporting cycle? And what can you do then in a budget for next year to move a step further? So I think keep that in mind.
Thanks, Tim. One from Simon around sort of a sustainability committee in terms of time commitment needed, but also generally how many people form part of that committee, and how would this work in some more granular detail? Or I guess, how have we seen that work with other organizations?
Again, a great question, but difficult to answer because every company will have their own dynamics, their own way of operating. So if you don't have anything ESG structure in your business, And yet then it's really, you're starting from scratch. So it's really about thinking like, what do I actually need from this particular structure? Are you just setting it up for this materiality assessment? Is it a test? Are you creating a temporary task force to get this done? Or you're thinking about, well, this needs to be something that is ongoing. So I'm setting up a sustainability committee that is going to help me with double materiality, but also a lot more. So I might tap onto them every month in a standing meeting. There might already be a sustainability board committee that you want to tap into, but you might still need a task force there. How many people? Depends on your company size, the number of departments, the buy-in you can get. So if there's a strong leadership team that gets this and wants to move this forward, it's a lot easier to get that cross-functional support and get people into your committee. If you're, again, that lone ranger trying to tap people and no one is interested, it is a lot harder. So the granular detail here really depends on where are you at as a business? What is your thinking? What is your education already? What are you trying to achieve? What are your objectives? And trying to put a structure around that. So that is one of those things we can definitely dive a bit deeper into if we have a one-on-one conversation. So I would recommend having a chat, book a meeting, have a chat to Tom and see, we can look at your situation and provide you a bit more in-depth detail there.
I think it's the same as well for Carol. Are there any good templates to survey the key stakeholders? Really, the survey templates would be defined by the topics that potentially cover materials. So that's derived from, what is your industry category? What are your peers doing? Is there any other macro potential trends that are going on around the world that could form essentially that topic list? So again, we can show you that, Carol, for your sort of industry and sector. We've got a list for sort of transport and logistics, so we can go through that with you. Probably final question from Gareth, and then we can wrap things up. So Gareth says, I work for a metropolitan Australian TAFE as the sustainability lead. I'm currently doing our first carbon footprint using a third-party reporting system. Should I also be running a double materiality at the same time, or would this be more relevant to corporates and even SMEs?
Great question. So I would say we have two distinct components here. So what you're doing now is you're looking at creating your greenhouse gas emissions inventory, which is really important. And yes, you have to tap into, your full supply chain there as well, your value chain. So you're looking at your own footprint in scope 1 and 2 and scope 3. But it's really climate focused, it's emissions focused. So it is one component of the E of environmental, of climate, of GHG. So it's a pretty specific focus that you're collecting data on. So really important work, and you'll see that this is one of the core components that you have to do under a lot of the regulation that is coming our way. But doing a double materiality assessment is, I think, taking that step back and looking at the landscape and saying, what should we be doing? What is material to us? And likely, if you run that exercise, you'll find out most likely that, yes, you'll be affected by climate-related regulation, so you'll have to report that GHG emissions inventory. So you already can tick the box for doing that. But there might be other areas there that you survey to doing a double materiality assessment where you feel, we find now that human rights and modern slavery is a key area, rated really important from a materiality perspective. We haven't done anything in that area. So to answer your question there, I think it is good practice to do a double materiality assessment to really get a sense of what are all the areas we should be focusing on and managing. And you're already likely will confirm that one of those areas you're already doing that carbon footprint on.
Thanks, Tim. So we'll wrap things up there. We will be sending around the recording shortly, coupled with these slides as well. If anyone's got any further questions, feel free to reach out or jump on our website, Google Social Suite. There's plenty more resources on our website around materiality. But thank you, everyone, for joining, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day. See you later.